The ancient cart-ruts of Malta in the Mediterranean are an enigma because it's not known with any certainty why, how, or when they were created. It's also intriguing that they are remarkably similar to those in Italy, Spain, Azerbaijan, Turkey, the Azores, and many other places. This gap in our knowledge has been filled with some wild ideas over the years. From alien landing strips to giant geoglyphs, there's no shortage of crazy hypotheses about what these tracks were for. However, although archaeologists may not have all the answers to all the questions about the Maltese CART-RUTS, they've put a lot of work into researching and mapping them and have been able to suggest a likely date, a likely function, and the mechanism by which they were created. In this video, I discuss this research and show you some fantastic footage of some of the more famous CART-RUTS. The Maltese CART-RUTS are parallel tracks carved or worn, probably both, into the bedrock. They mostly have a gauge of 1.4 meters, but their depths vary. The base of each track is usually V-shaped, but there are examples of U-shaped and rectangular-shaped profiles. Some CART-RUTS run in straight lines, others curve, and pairs of tracks often cross over one another. There are examples to be found on flat land as well as on slopes, and they run in lots of different directions. In Malta, there are hundreds of these tracks, and since they are not depicted on prehistoric artifacts or mentioned in historic texts and are not associated with other datable features in the landscape, scholars have had a hard time allocating them to a specific time period. It's also been particularly difficult to allocate a function to them that accommodates all of their varied characteristics. It's important to mention that although CART-RUTS in other countries do resemble those in Malta, that doesn't necessarily mean there's a correlation. The CART-RUTS in Malta are almost always found in coralline limestone. Malta's geological makeup is mostly lower and upper coralline and globigerina limestone. Coralline is hard and rough, whereas globigerina is soft and smooth. So it's possible that if the ruts were made to facilitate some sort of vehicles, they were mostly carved on exposed coralline surfaces since these were difficult to move across otherwise. However, globigerina is much easier to traverse. That said, it could also be that CART-RUTS worn into globigerina limestone simply haven't survived so well due to erosion. It has been suggested that the CART-RUTS may have originally been covered in soil. This could explain why the central bulk between each pair of ruts does not have hoof marks from whatever animals pulled the vehicle. However, for the ruts to be as worn as they are, the soil cover would have had to be thin, which would have been practically impossible to maintain for long periods on inclines and when it was windy or when it rained a lot. One other argument for soil cover is a dissolution hollow at a site in Nashar. How would a vehicle have navigated such a hollow unless there was soil cover? However, archaeologists think that the dissolution hollow itself was filled with soil, but the CART-RUT leading up to it and continuing on the other side was not. The way the CART-RUT tips into the lip of the hollow shows that it must have affected the movement of the vehicle with a jolt, but did not stop it entirely. Although CART-RUTS are referred to in the way they are, they may not have been for carts at all. A discussion on what they were for, though, is inextricably linked with the argument over when they were made. So before I get started on that, I just want to give a quick summary of Malta's prehistoric and historic periods that are relevant to the subject of CART-RUTS. The prehistoric dates I'm talking about here are taken from the Fraxis project, which was a series of excavations carried out between 2013 and 2018. One of the many outcomes of the project was that it helped refine the various prehistoric occupation phases of the Maltese Islands. 3 monographs and many papers were published following the project and are free to download if you want some really good factual information on Neolithic Malta. Malta was first inhabited during the Neolithic from about 5570 BCE for around 200 years. Some of the pottery from this early Neolithic phase is similar in style to Stentinello wares from Sicily and Calabria, so it's likely that seafaring farmers travelled south from there before settling in Malta. The population was then much reduced, or the islands were abandoned altogether for around 300 years. In about 4060 BCE, the islands were once again occupied, and both tombs and settlements have been dated to that period. However, it would be more than another 300 years before this culture embarked on its megalithic building projects. Several phases have been identified for this particular cultural expression, which lasted a full millennium before the islands were abandoned once again. It was then that a Bronze Age culture moved in around 2390 BCE. In some areas, they reused the megalithic structures, such as at the Tarshian temples, which they turned into a cremation cemetery. A second Bronze Age culture has been identified after this one, and there may have been a period of abandonment between the two. However, this isn't certain. Following the Bronze Age, Malta became a Phoenician colony before falling under the control of Carthage 300 years later, a time referred to as the Punic period. It then fell to the Romans during the First Punic War. So when I talk about the classical period or classical antiquity, I'm referring to a rather broad time range that encompasses Phoenician, Punic, and Roman control of the islands. Practically all hypotheses related to the cart-ruts put them in either the Bronze Age or the Classical period, with some limited support for the Neolithic as part of the temple builders' activities. Let's go through the main hypotheses for what the cart-ruts functioned as. Since they do resemble field furrows found at Arran in Ireland and other similar sites in the British Isles, in 2004, renowned archaeologist Claudia Sagona proposed that they were carved during the Neolithic period for irrigation purposes. Her research was on the most famous set of cart-ruts in an area called Misra el-Kabir in Maltese, but which is also colloquially known as Clapham Junction after the English railway station. The Maltese name refers to a cave there which was inhabited up until modern times, whereas the English nickname is 100% about the cart-ruts that look a bit like rails at a busy train station. However, much of what Sagona suggested was respectfully refuted by a team of archaeologists in the monograph The Significance of Cart-Ruts in Ancient Landscapes. They gave a comprehensive set of reasons, which include that the cart-ruts are in pairs rather than single ruts in a set, as field furrows generally are. They are on slopes as well as flatlands, so water would run off, and they point in lots of different directions rather than having a uniform distribution. Furthermore, the field furrow hypotheses would only work for areas like Clapham Junction, where there are many cart-ruts condensed in one area, rather than at the many other sites across the islands where there are much less cart-ruts present. A similar idea suggested that they were for collecting rainwater, but there are problems with this, such as the slopes and the lack of reservoirs connected to cart-rut channels. The most likely function was that the cart-ruts made up transport systems, both localized for intensive activities such as at Clapham Junction and to connect distant sites, as in the case of long singular trackways traversing the islands. Since many sites are close to ancient quarries, it's likely that the localized activities mentioned were for transporting limestone blocks. This also matches the wear patterns because whatever method of transportation was used, the load must have been heavy enough to wear the ruts down as much as they were. Soil, water, agricultural produce, and marine resources have all been suggested as potential loads, but they would not have been heavy enough to wear down the ruts. Of course, the fact that cart-ruts and quarries are found close to one another doesn't necessarily mean a correlation between the two. Shallow ancient quarries are found where there's exposed bedrock, and cart-ruts appear to have been needed at any place where coralline limestone was to be found, probably because, as I said earlier, it's very rough and difficult to move across otherwise. So it could be a coincidence that they both happen to be anywhere there's exposed bedrock. However, research was carried out at Clapham Junction, and one solid example that associates the two was found. In the area to the east of the site, known as Tat Dun Cons, several cart-ruts run for 200 metres from the northeast to the southwest before one cart-rut then curves northwards and enters the remains of a classical period quarry. At that point, a modern rubble wall cuts the quarry off. Beyond this, an agricultural field covers the rest of the original quarry. What remains of it is at a depth of 1 meter, and the cart-rut is worn into this at a depth of 45 centimeters. So there can be no doubt that the two are correlated. This also dates this particular cart-rut to the time this quarry was excavated in order to supply ashlar blocks to urban building projects. Temple sites and settlements have been found dating to the classical period, and these were made of ashlar blocks such as the Domus Romana or Roman townhouse in Rabat, which is the modern name for the ancient town of Melita. Of course, assigning a more specific date than the broad allocation of classical antiquity isn't possible at this point. The quarry may well have been in use during the Phoenician, Punic or Roman times. In the area of Clapham Junction, there are several classical period regular quarries, so it seems likely there was a connection. These have mostly been reclaimed and covered with agricultural fields, which is why they are difficult to study. The idea that the cart-ruts were associated with Neolithic quarries, where megaliths were excavated to build the temples, is not supported by evidence. None of the cart-ruts run right up to the temples, and irregular quarries were used in the Neolithic, which are hard to identify in the landscape. To the west of the Tat Dun Con site is an intriguing feature that's led many archaeologists to assign a Bronze Age date to the cart-ruts. A late Punic shaft tomb cuts into one pair, which means the rut must have been made first. However, this does not necessarily mean the cart-rut needs to belong to the Bronze Age. It could also belong to the Punic period or earlier in classical antiquity. A similar shaft tomb can be found cutting into a cart-rut at a site in Mtafa as well. Another argument for a Bronze Age date comes from St. George's Bay in the village of Berzabuja. This village has the remains of a Neolithic temple and a Bronze Age settlement on a hill in the area known as Borj-in-Nadur. On the coast, around 100 meters from Borj-in-Nadur, there are Bronze Age silos and a cart-rut that runs into the sea. More on that particular cart-rut later. There are no cart-ruts adjoining the temple, the settlement, or the silos. However, before the area was built up, there were more cart-ruts there, as evidenced by photographs taken in the 1920s. And 4 of these intersected with Bronze Age silos. By the way, silos were used for the storage of grain and water. By analysing the photographs, archaeologists were able to tell that 2 of these cart-ruts were created later than the silos, 1 before, and 1 isn't clear due to vegetation cover. This means that, at least in the case of Berzabuja, Bronze Age examples do also exist. In other countries, cart-ruts that have been more firmly dated do fall into the Bronze Age as well as classical antiquity, not to mention more recent times as well. So it's perfectly plausible that Malta's cart-ruts were made during different time periods. Wheeled carts first appeared in Europe during the Bronze Age. So if these ruts were created for them, there's no reason why they wouldn't have been a technology that belonged to different cultures occupying the island at different times. At the Domus Romana in Rabat, there is also one single cart-rut. This runs along a street at the back of the townhouse where the remains of other smaller buildings have been found. The Domus Romana was a large property that most likely belonged to an elite family during the 1st century BCE. Several mosaics, sculptures, and architectural components were excavated there in the early 20th century, and the site was then turned into a museum. However, the townhouse was not alone. It was part of a densely packed, fortified urban town, not a lot of which survived. The cart-rut to the rear of the townhouse therefore dates to the same time period as the urban block it's found within. Returning to the subject of the cart-rut that goes under the sea. During the last glacial maximum, Malta wasn't covered in ice, but it did have a much wetter climate, and the sea level in the Mediterranean was around 120 meters lower. This meant that Malta was joined to Sicily by a land bridge which enabled fauna to travel south. Also in Berzabuja, there is a cave called Ardalum, which has an excellent stratigraphic record of the fauna that existed in Malta from 180,000 years ago up until modern times. Evidence for the earliest human occupation of Malta was also found there in the top layer, which, as I said earlier, is about 8,000 years ago. The cart-rut that goes under the sea apparently used to emerge on the opposite side of the bay before modern construction destroyed it. This has led to the wild idea that it was created during the last glacial maximum when the sea level was a lot lower, even though there's no evidence for human habitation in Malta at that time. According to experts, it's much more likely that the sea level in St. George's Bay rose slightly since the cart-ruts were created as a result of localized seismic activity. Personally, I have another comment on this that I haven't seen anyone else notice. In the area of St. Julian's, there is a valley called Weed Ha Hamim that, during the last ice age, would have had a river gushing through it. There are cart-ruts there too, so they must be from a much later and drier time. Another interesting cart-rut is one near the town of Rabat that goes off the edge of a cliff. It's part of a network of other ruts, and I found this one quite strange myself. When I'd only heard about it, I assumed it probably ran along the edge of the cliff and was then interrupted as a result of rockfall, but it actually shoots right off the edge. However, as you can see from this photograph, this rock has been split in two, most likely from seismic activity, so there could conceivably have been a larger land area there several thousand years ago, meaning that the cart-rut actually ran into a quarry. Over the years, a lot of field experiments have been carried out to see what sort of vehicle could have created the cart-ruts. Some of these were featured on a BBC documentary in 1955. It's generally accepted that the tracks were initially cut by tools before being worn deeper by the repeated movement of vehicles that used them. 3 vehicle types have been tested: sledges, slide cars, and wheeled carts. Sledges struggled to make the sharp turns that can be found at many cart-rut sites, including this one at Nashar. They also encountered a lot of friction. Both slide cars and wheeled carts pulled by either animals or people fared a lot better. However, slide cars are unknown in the Mediterranean world in the Bronze Age or Classical Antiquity. It's far more likely that the ruts were used by 2 wheeled carts with differing shaped profiles being caused by different sized wheels. The lack of hoof marks on the bulks between the cart ruts can be explained by unshoed oxen pulling the carts. So in summary, although there's limited evidence with which to date the Maltese cart-ruts, several can be comfortably assigned to the Bronze Age and others to, broadly speaking, the Classical period. In Punic Roman times, they appear to have been used for transporting ashlar limestone blocks from regular quarries. Variations in the depth of the ruts support the idea that loads of different weights were moved around by 2-wheeled carts that likely varied in size to accommodate the transportation requirements. Since there are areas of Malta with dense networks of cart ruts crisscrossing over each other and stretches with less cart ruts which connect points over longer distances, they were probably used for intensive quarrying activities as well as the transportation of the blocks to sites where they were needed as building materials. The impression I get from the sheer number of cart-ruts is that there must have been a lot of quarries on the island in the Classical period, which implies lots of building activity and a sizable population, at least towards the time of the Roman occupation, for which there's a reasonable amount of archaeological evidence. It appears that the town of Melita was pretty sizable then, even though limited buildings and only a small part of the original defensive wall have been found. Nowadays is the town of Rabat, and it's very built up, which is why not much archaeological material has seen the light. Apart from the townhouse, the most famous classical period sites in Rabat are the catacomb complexes outside the former city walls, which also suggests that the town was heavily populated at that time. Malta is also mentioned in several Roman texts. So it seems to me that the cart-ruts, at least in classical antiquity, were part of a bustling construction industry. One thing Malta wasn't short on at the time and still isn't short of is limestone. That's it. Thank you to my patrons and channel members. Don't forget to hit the like button if you didn't already, and I'll see you next time.